a result of the dominance and eventual ascendancy of the Bolsheviks in their translation into communism, where they reconstructed an entirely different government system that operated under the direction of the ideology. The ideology, through the party, was dominant in every aspect of life within Russia. Therefore, everything that was done, much as we might bristle at some of the things that were done, was consistent with the legal structures. The second part that was of critical importance in Russia, but it became of major importance in Nazi Germany, was that the courts were also brought into this ideology. So there was no particular reference the courts had other than the ideology itself as it was expressed through the mechanisms of government. Now, because we're still struggling, I'm going to make a particular change here, and eventually we might be able to bring these things up.
Michael?
Yes.
They're up here.
The people you people who are Zooming can see the slides, right?
Yes.
Yes, it's just the people here who cannot.
Okay.
I don't know how to fix that. Yeah, I can do that. All right. I can certainly let you pass. Or, you know what would work? Seriously, let's bring the table out where you can all cluster around. You know, frankly, forget this 6-foot distance nonsense. I don't want to get too structured about science, but I will tell you that all of that issue about 6 feet is nothing more than laboratory experiments that contain very little reality in life. And the second part is that you're all wearing masks. So unless you're going to sneeze and cough and breathe and slobber over each other, the chances that you're going to get sick is 0.
And they're all vaccinated anyway.
Really small. Yeah, and not only that, but if you get sick, you're going to get sick anyway. You know, and who knows it happened here? It could have happened anywhere. So I'm going to take that break. I'll take care of this.
Yeah. Put the camera on BU Lyceum Pass.
Different.
Start your video on BU Lyceum class.
Just click here first. Just click on that.
Yes, it started. We're having some technical difficulties.
All right. I'll fuss with this. You go ahead and pull that table out and let's get everybody clustered around, because otherwise we're going to lose the whole shooting match here. What?
Can you turn the camera on your computer, Doc? Video.
That's another way to do it, is to show the camera here.
Right.
All right. Okay.
Turn your camera on, Doc.
Right.
And the video, right? And share screen. You're sharing the screen, so that's fine.
Yeah, we're ending up with all kinds of nonsense here. This is.
There you go. Whoop. No. Oh dear, what's going on there?
Okay, but now I'm trying to move the slides and this doesn't want to move them.
Well, you're also taking a picture of your own screen. You're not taking a picture of yourself.
Okay,
Not sure why, but
let me see. I'm not sure which slide I'm at right now, but
the 25-point program, stormtroopers, Heinrich Himmler.
all right. There we
Hey,
go.
one more, yeah, okay,
That's where I need to be.
right. But we need
Okay.
to see you, not your computer, so we need to have the camera pointing at you. You're sharing your screen, so we see your slides, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So at least
Can
in
you
the
see the slide now? Henry?
yes, I can see the slide and I see we have a normal presentation of the class and Zoom. But for the Lyceum, we don't see you personally. We see a picture of your.
We see him now. It says Lyceum.
Yeah, you don't need to see me
No.
particularly unless you're really.
Oh, there you are.
Still
Okay.
looking for a
Yeah.
Halloween
No,
costume.
no. We're
Oh.
right. We got you. We got you.
I want to ask everybody on Zoom to turn their camera off because if your camera is active and you make your speak and you'll take it over, and I want the only screen to be active is this the one from this computer.
Yeah, that's fine, Tom. But you need to turn the sound off on BU Lyceum class. So mute BU Lyceum class. So we get the doc only speaking. Just mute BU Lyceum class.
Okay. So one of the fundamental questions that exists in this situation, again, I'm trying to make this system function over here and it's being deficient. I don't know why this is being so contrary, but
Yeah, well, we're trying to.
It is.
But I don't have control.
okay. Okay, let's start with this one.
Hey, Henry, can you turn
Yes.
off your camera?
It's not nothing to
Henry?
do with this.
Can you
Yeah.
turn off your camera?
I understand. Thank you very much. What
You're
we
welcome.
really need to do is turn the sound off on BU Lyceum class.
Okay. Get that? He said, turn the sound off on the BU Lyceum class also. So mute that.
And Mike is muted on Lyceum.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that.
This is a real pain. This is just getting worse, not better.
So it shows you as muted under the Lyceum.
Yeah, and I'm trying to
Okay.
fix it, but the damn thing, sorry, this.
And I
darn
think
thing-
I think you are coming through on BU's Lyceum class. It's a little faded though.
Right. Well, Christmas sakes. This is just not good. Oh, for Christmas sakes. Okay, we got something. Can you folks hear me or not? Yeah, but somebody can push a space bar and tell me if they hear it.
I'm pushing the damn thing. Yes, we can hear you. Okay,
Hello.
now turn off BU Lyceum classes sound, mute it. Not you, Doc. Let Tom do it. He's supposed to be able to do this.
Yeah. All right, folks, you can hear me?
Yeah,
Okay. And you can see at least the screen. Would somebody please turn off the front lights? Because that'll create a little less glare and this may be a little easier to see. And we'll figure out what other disasters we can come to within a short period of time. I don't know if for those of you sitting here in this audience want to come closer, there's a way to make that clear, but I'll read it very quickly if it's not legible. They're rioting in Africa, they're starving in Spain, there's hurricanes in Florida, and Texas needs rain. The whole world is festering with unhappy souls. The French hate the Germans hate the Poles. Italians hate Yugoslavs, South Africans hate the Dutch, and I don't like anybody very much. But we can be tranquil and thankful and proud, for man's been endowed with a mushroom-shaped cloud. And we know for certain that some lovely day, someone will set the spark off and we will all be blown away. They're rioting in Africa, there's strife in Iran. What nature doesn't do to us will be done by our fellow man. Now, in a sense, that typifies what is happening in the world at that time, as particularly we approach the concerns for World War II. And as you may know from your own readings in the past, the atomic bomb became one of the key elements that countries were working towards developing. But in particular, this is the element that is of, I think, particular critical importance. Hitler became chancellor in 1933. He had to do it based on a coalition because the Nazi Party itself was not sufficiently strong to command the legislature. But within a very short period of time, if his ascendancy, and Hindenburg at this time, while president and theoretically could appoint whomever he wished as prime minister or chancellor, just knew that no other party was able to formulate a coalition which could produce an effective government. And Hindenburg himself was approaching death near this time frame. Shortly after Hitler took over as chancellor, there was a fire at the Reichstag. The Reichstag, for those of you who may not be familiar, is basically like our Capitol building. And this fire was very destructive. Within a short period of time, 4 different people were identified as being culprits. Only one was found guilty, and this person was executed. What appeared to be the case, and was certainly the major thrust of news reporting, I'm not going to use the word propaganda, news reporting, was that this was instigated by the communists. And in the last lecture, we talked at length about how the Communist Party in Russia influenced the communist cells within Germany to the point where there were actual revolutions in different sections of Germany during that period of time. So this was something that fit into the narrative in a very big way. And without trying to overdo the effect of the animosity that existed in Hitler's mind and the threat that the communists portrayed, it really opened the door for Hitler to perform certain acts which legitimized further actions. In other words, he was setting the stage for himself to eventually take great control. One of these elements had to do with a defect within the Weimar Constitution, which was operative at this time, and that was that it gave the chancellor real opportunity to issue executive orders, is what we call them now, but they were basically legal documents, more than an executive order, all right? It had more force than that. And as a result of these actions, he could subvert, even if it wasn't in his mind at the time, but he could subvert the basic other protections that the Weimar Constitution was supposed to present to the population. And within this particular framework, he was able to restrict the rights of personal freedom, such as habeas corpus, which existed in a slightly different form in Germany, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom to organize and assemble, and so on and so on and so on. He also allowed for warrants for people who represented the police force and investigatory units within the government to basically go into houses and look for information, confiscate property as they needed, and going well beyond the usual limits that existed within a legally framed organization. Now, what did all this mean? It meant through legal structures, because the ideology was the principal motivator for everything that would happen, not morality as we understand it, but the ideology now allowed for the legal system through its entirety to be directed towards creating this utopia that most ideologies seek. One of the critical ones was right here, the Enabling Act, which again occurred within a short period of time after the Reichstag fire. Think of what happened in this country when the Twin Towers were struck. Right now, again, I'm not saying that what was happening through the Patriot Act was evil, but what it did is it legitimized functions the federal government heretofore had not been permitted to do. So you could begin to spy on American citizens, looking for the next group here in the United States, which might set up the next 9/11. So again, the issue here is your sense of security compared to your sense of liberty. And you may recall that I think it's Thomas Jefferson who said, those who would trade their liberty for security shall have neither. Within this particular construct, if you're dealing with the enormous stresses that Germany was experiencing in particular, security became paramount in most everyone's mind. And the way you get that security is to give up certain liberties. And over time, we'll see how that translated. One of the key elements is right here, the Enabling Act. Laws of the right enacted by the government. You say, well, of course, that's what they do anyway. May deviate from the Constitution. Now, how do you do that in this country? You'd have to have the Supreme Court say that the Constitution either can be pushed aside due to the exigencies of our situation. Lincoln even said that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, okay, back in the Civil War. So you have a situation where certain things can be suspended and legitimized by the Supreme Court in the United States. And that's taking away any of the political or philosophic issues that any of the justices might bring to the fore. Okay? So keep this in mind. This is something that every government faces throughout its entire history, is how are these things going to be managed or controlled? Laws enacted shall be issued by the Chancellor. Okay, that's like the executive signing it. Treaties shall not require the consent of legislative authorities. So the Chancellor can set up treaties. In our country, treaties, as carefully defined, have to go to the Senate. That's written in the Constitution. But what about something like the Paris Accords? Is that a treaty or not? Because it commits the United States to certain actions. Now, you can agree that that's a good thing to do, And you may even agree that it's appropriate within the powers granted to the executive branch to do that. But the opponents would say that is a treaty. You're setting up certain obligations for the United States to follow, but you haven't done it with the consent of the Senate. So these are issues which we see going on even today. And again, you can pick whichever side you wish. I'm not here to proselytize for one or the other. I just want it recognized as to the nature of the debate. Okay, all right. So within several years, these acts basically led to the Reichstag, the legislative body of Germany, to get rid of all political opponents. Again, remember that when you restructure the legitimacy of the government through its laws, you give it certain powers, and those powers are exercised according to the philosophy that underpins those legislators. But in situations, if you are inclined to say, my ideology trumps everything, morality as such, as might be taught in your church, is irrelevant to the function of society, then all of these things become permissible, indeed legal. We need to keep that part in mind. I had shown this before because this was a form of discussion that Hitler used in order to explain the difference between the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, and socialism as such, as might be expressed by Mussolini and the fascists, and particularly draw a distinction against communism, as expressed by Lenin and then Stalin. And these things, when you read through it, become very interesting. Great inventions, discoveries, achievements, the product of the individual brain. I'm not against private property, okay? But in legitimizing what happens down the road, as expressed by Wilson, even before he was president, I need in place experts who can help direct the economy in the right areas in order to prevent the kind of chaos we saw in the 20s when we had hyperinflation, and as we're dealing now with a deep and serious depression. In other words, security trumps your liberty. This is one of the next steps. Now, what about the people who supported him? Again, our understanding of many of these people is based on our own particular prejudices that we've grown up with since we were children in watching hallelujah. As we write it down, whatever you did. The legitimization requires people who are allied with you philosophically and personally in order to carry through these particular things. But who were these people? Were these a bunch of ne'er-do-wells who were idiots and cowardly and all the rest of it? No, many of these people were supremely well-educated and had demonstrated their courage in wartime prior to this happening. And that courage was demonstrated further as they literally risked their lives in order to move their agenda forward. Now, we can go back and look at the American Revolution and say that's a similar process. Only in our own mind's eye, we view the American Revolution as a good thing to happen. But from the Brits' standpoint, we were a bunch of rebels who couldn't understand our legacy, much less tried to overturn it as we tore down statues of George III and the rest of it. Okay? And we're working to create our own sort of utopia, if you want to look at it that way, in what was colonial America and became the United States. A person like Hermann Göring, who certainly had major problems as an individual, had been one of the premier fighter aces in World War I. He took over Richthofen's flying circus, the Red Baron, you may have heard him called. And he had 22 victories. That meant that in individual combat, he shot down 22 opposing planes. So that's not at all. And he got pour le mérite, right? Comparable to the Congressional Medal of Honor. So this was not an idiot, okay? But he allied himself with Hitler. And unfortunately for Goering, and perhaps partly for Germany, he was also, due to his wounding in the beer hall push. Remember, I said, these guys put their lives on the line, all right? So he was wounded there, ended up addicted to morphine. But he had personality quirks as well. If you're going to become a commander and you're going to be aggressive enough to shoot down 22 opposing airplanes, you've got to be, in a way, an egoist at the very least, if not a narcissist, right? Okay. How about Rudolph Hess? Again, seen as one of these sort of incompetent, idiotic people, but he actually had considerable education. He was injured protecting Hitler from a bomb in 1920. This is even before the beer hall pushed, because the Nazi rallies were interrupted violently, often by opponents, among whom the communists were part of the big deal. The Social Democrats were another part. So here he is taking part. He got involved in the beer hall push. He spent time in prison with Hitler, and he helped him write Mein Kampf. Okay.
All right, well, we'll talk later.
Owner, mute yourself, please.
Who was speaking? I didn't hear it.
The named owner has still got this sound on and they're interrupting you.
Oh, okay. All right. How about Goebbels? Again, Goebbels is seen as a fanatic, and he was, not much question about it. But he's also seen as this skinny kind of, in fact, I saw this in one of the articles I read, ferret-faced, talkative individual. In other words, bring him down. Don't give him any position in our own mind's eye currently of any authority, because we know how evil a man he was to link himself not just to Hitler, but to the whole ideology. But was Goebbels stupid? He got a PhD. He'd written 14 books. This guy was very competent. And he had various ranks that he assumed later on. How about Himmler? Well, again, not very distinguished. Again, made fun of him many, many times. He certainly did not have an imposing physical presence. But as you look at it, he attended a technical university. So he had been an educated man. He became involved in the organization and demonstrated skills from 1923 when he joined the Nazi Party and was involved in the beer hall push as well, put his life on the line, showed himself to have considerable organizational skills. And although his military skills were deficient, something that shows up more dramatically in World War II, particularly on the Eastern Front in 1944-45. We won't get into that. But he begins to set up a system which will do a number of different things. One is he helps part of the elite guard, the Schutzstaffel, the SS, to be Hitler's personal bodyguard, like the Roman Praetorian Guard, or the Janissaries and other groups that all governments tended to have as their personal armed force. But he also became linked into the SA later on, and he achieved very high positions of authority to administrative levels. So again, not a guy who was stupid. He was a psychopath. I certainly grant that. His view of humanity was very unlike what we ourselves may tend to believe. Oh, sorry, wrong way. There we go. How about Strasser? Won the Iron Cross, both classes. We don't hear about Strasser very much, okay? And there's a reason for that. But he also linked himself to the Nazi Party, participated in the beer hall push. He helped organize many of the structures of Nazi influence throughout Germany. But because he ended up with conflicts related to Hitler, he was eventually shot. Okay. Now, we've all heard to some extent about stormtroopers, and that's a term that's used even when you look at videos and news reports during the January 6th riot at the Capitol. You'll hear news people use that term, stormtroopers, because what they want to fix in our minds is a link back to the Nazi era. So keep that in mind. It's just how we use language to create ideas. And the point I want to make here, I don't know how we lost that. All right. What did you do? Okay. I'll keep talking as we go. One of the first meetings of the German Workers' Party, which became the Nazi Party, was in October 16, 1919. So that's a long time, 20 years before people say this is when World War II broke out. 70 people attended, hardly an overwhelming group. It takes a month before he gets about double that number, half of whom came just to make fun of him, to make fun of the speech. But there were friends there, supporters of Hitler, and of course they got into a brawl. That's going to happen. And you could see it happen if you want to go back, for example, and look at some of the early marches in the 20s. I mean, in 2020, in various cities around the United States. Various groups would start heckling each other, and pretty soon they'd be coming to blows. Hitler realized that if things like this are going to happen, he needs a contingent which is going to suppress the heckling and allow him to get his word out. In other words, he's not going to permit what we call nowadays the heckler's veto. If you want an example of that, you can go back and look at what happened to BU when we had I think it was the ambassador from Israel trying to talk, and they were literally shouting him down so he couldn't speak. That's a heckler's veto, okay? So he felt he needed to have an armed group because fighting had already broken out on several occasions, and this was becoming almost the norm. Just several months after his 140, he's now up to 2,000. They meet in a beer hall, okay? And that's where the meetings are, that's where the people are, that's where they come and get drunk and have fun and go beat each other up. But at that particular time, he prevents the 25 points, and I'll come to that in a little bit. In August, he creates an organization called the Creation of Gymnastics and Sports Division. He has to use this as a cover for the SA, which is a group of veterans that's growing up around this period of time, because he needs legitimization. He doesn't want to call them the SA. That carries with it the term stormtrooper, basically, all right? So he does this deliberately. And then just a couple months later, there's yet another battle that takes place. So it's as though he has got this all set in stone, and the necessity for having it is established. If you're going to have people fighting each other, then you're not going to let the other side win, correct? I mean, why would you do that otherwise? What about the 25-point program? When you look through this and just look at the big titles, because it's over several slides, the idea behind this is that a lot of these make sense, but at the same time, he delegitimizes a whole section of the German population, of the citizenry, okay? So you watch this carefully, because this becomes the legal basis on which subsequent actions are set. When you've legitimized it, then everybody has to follow. It's very important to think about that. You don't have any choice in this matter. The power of government is used to enforce the law. Without any power, the government can't enforce the law. And it can choose not to enforce the law, but if it decides to, it can also figure out whom to target. Who's going to be given just a thumb press or who's going to be hit with a sledgehammer? My choice is the government. You may think, well, that's not right, that's not consistent. It doesn't matter if I have the legal authority to do it. And this is what's now happening in Germany. And Hitler spells this right out. None but members of the nation may be citizens of the state. But it's the next phrase. None but those of German blood, whatever their creed might be, no Jew. Now, how do you separate that out? Morally, you'd look at it and say, I don't understand that. Doesn't mean it's inconsistent. It doesn't matter that it's inconsistent. It's consistent with the ideology. And this is where Nazism departed from fascism. It became about race. And the idea of a Jew being white-skinned was irrelevant. It was the ethnicity that put you into that bucket and allowed for Germany, the German government, to establish the definition of who was a Jew. And you'll see, I think, in a slide exactly how that plays out. But when you look at this, whoever has no citizenship is able to live in Germany only as a guest. He's securing the borders. Okay, you can come in, but you're a guest. That means we can kick you out anytime we want. You're subject to our laws. You don't bring your laws in here and tell us how to behave. No, no, no. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Okay, all right. Opportunity for livelihood, a way of life for all citizens. We hear that today. You need to have a living wage. In Japan, they guarantee employment. Interesting. Immigration of non-Germans must be prevented. And those who came after 2nd August 1914, you got to get out of here, right? Your visa's expired. And if we find you, we'll kick you out. It doesn't matter how many there are. This is not based on, well, there are 1 million of you and it's going to be too difficult. No, they've got police units that can go around, check your papers and say, you are not here legitimately. I'm taking you to jail. I'm going to put you on a bus and I'm sending you back to your home country. And if they don't want you, that's their problem, but you're not staying here. Abolition of unearned incomes. Oh, the rich. Bill Gates, right? Bezos, Zuckerberg. You didn't earn that, right? We've heard that phrase. You didn't build that. If you can say that and make it legal, it means you can do what you want. You didn't build that. Therefore, the natural conclusion is I can take it from you. And that's what happens, okay? Personal enrichment due to war profits must be regarded as a crime. And many of us would agree with that, okay? You just can't milk the nation because you're in a conflict. Oh, sorry. Sometimes this thing goes a little bit screwy. Okay. There's, oh, here we go. All right, my apologies, folks. I challenged. Okay. Expansion on a large scale of old age welfare, creation of a healthy middle class, land reform, struggle against those whose activity is injurious to the general interest. Now think about that for a minute. Who defines the general interest and whose action is injurious? And you can be punished by death. Okay? Struggle against those. The state is responsible for the fundamental reconstruction of our national education program. That debate's going on in our country right now. Who gets to decide what's taught in a school? If any of you paid attention, and again, I'm not coming down positive or negative, but if you listen to the debates in Virginia, and McAuliffe was saying, parents stay out of deciding what's taught in schools. In a sense, those are our children to teach, and we as experts know what's best for them. Not you. You're coming in with your prejudices and who knows what that you want to have taught or not taught. That's just not right. Okay? And notice that it's as early as the beginning of understanding. In other words, preschool. We are going to start indoctrinating the children about the principles that we feel are essential to a unified, functioning German society. Because if we don't do that, who knows what ideas are going to resonate in their heads. The Jesuits used to say, give me a child until he's 10 and I'll have him forever. So again, this is nothing unusual. It's been done before and it's still part of our makeup. Outlaw child labor, physical fitness. Look at this, right? Legal opposition to known lies in their promulgation through the press. What has been the recent discussion about big tech, about Zuckerberg having algorithms which knock people off Facebook, or Twitter that does the same, delegitimizes your platform. You no longer can do this, right? We've decided this is not right. Only here, the decisions that are made are coming from the government. And they have to be consistent with our ideology. Publications which are counter to the general good are to be forbidden. Okay. Freedom of religion, you'd say, well, that sounds good. Okay. And combats the Jewish materialistic spirit. So Jews, for their religion, are considered not as a religious group, but as an ethnic group. And that's how you get around this, you see? But this is legal. This is permitted. This is what is considered best for the nation. Strong central power of the Reich, unlimited authority over the whole Reich. We talk about the ascendancy of the federal government over states. That's a part of what the Civil War was fought over, but it's been fought over through the Supreme Court forever. You see, those arguments are still with us today. Now, in terms of going on further with the essay, I'm not going to read this, I spent a lot of time on it, but what I want to point out is that in 1930, there was a revolt in Berlin. Okay. And the attempt was to create an order that overthrew the Republic by force. And this was directed against Hitler due to some real tensions that existed in the beginning. And I'm not going to go into that at this point. The idea is that Ernst Röhm, whose name is there in the second paragraph under 24, is looking to displace Hitler at some point. And his authority is now subverting Hitler's authority, and they actually create this open revolt, and it's finally suppressed. But when Hitler takes the power over the SA, as well as the SA, and he's now going to begin to meld them together, the administrative duties that Hitler has to carry are so profound and widespread that it becomes impossible for him to do it. So he actually calls Rome back, because Rome had been a supporter of his in spite of this effect for a long period of time. Okay. But then as you go 3 years later, Rome is again seen as plotting against Hitler. And there's a particular quotation that showed up, and I showed them here. as to what he said. Hitler's own particular, he today fights on our side, cannot win great laurels, far less can he win great material goods. It is more likely he will end up in jail. He who today is a leader must be an idealist. The revolution is not a permanent condition. We cannot allow it to become so. There's a bit of a separation between communism and Nazi philosophy. But you need a period of stabilization that we talked about during the discussion on Russia. Now, look at that last part, that Rome is coerced into signing a declaration the Reichstag is dominant, bristles. What that ridiculous corporal said doesn't concern us. If we can't work with Hitler, we shall get on without him. Hitler is a traitor. We'll have to send him on a long vacation, which doesn't mean that they were going to send him to Nice in France, okay? This was a permanent vacation. So the point I'm trying to make is that Hitler realizes all that's going on. And while he tried to keep Rome at his side, almost that idea of keep your friends close and your enemies closer, he still realized the subversive effect that Rome is carrying out. Plus, it turns out, and you have to go back into the 30s to understand this, homosexuality was seen as a distinct aberration, okay? And it was suppressed or hidden in a lot of different ways, including many countries, including the United States and Britain, for example, that had laws specifically against homosexuality. But Rome and a number of his top leaders were almost blatant homosexuals in terms of their sexual orientation. So this was, again, another piece that fed into German culture at the time that delegitimized Rome's own position. And Hitler has to do something about it. In addition, he's being pressed by the army to say, we cannot have a competition between us and the SA. The SA has gotten big and they got a lot of weapons. So somehow or another, you, Hitler, because remember, he designated himself as head of the SA, you have to do something to bring this under control. So what does he do? He already got Rome kicked out once, and that didn't solve the problem. So this is what happens. They end up killing about 1,000. Rome is not executed immediately. He's in jail for a number of months. Hitler's still toying with the idea whether he really has to get rid of his long-term buddy or not. And finally hands an order over to the police and says, you can put a gun in front of Rome with one bullet and ask him to do the right thing. And if he refuses, shoot him. Rome refused to commit suicide, so he was shot in his cell. Now, again, think of this as an idea of legitimization of everything that's going to happen, the Nuremberg Laws. Now, again, I try not to read this whole thing to you, but I think the first sentence is of great importance. Aryan descent. If you're not of Aryan descent, doesn't matter your position, you're gone. Okay? Doesn't matter what you've done, how many years you've served, you're gone. Now, if you think that's a little far-fetched, again, think of businesses that require you to be vaccinated. You have people in hospitals, nurses, doctors, staff, who've worked all through the COVID period when there wasn't a vaccine and are being let go because they won't be vaccinated. All you have to do is look it up, read it in the newspaper. So here's an example of where you can just decide. Only instead of vaccination, we're saying of Aryan descent, which bristles much more than the idea of vaccination. But in your own mind, just think about the distinction. Why are you making that distinction? What's the moral basis on which you make it? And how do you come down on that side? Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to do it. I'm not saying it's right to do it. I'm simply pointing it out in terms of the lecture. Members of the Communist Party, of course, because they've been subverting the country for now almost 2 decades. It started before World War I, but it was carried out particularly after that. Now, Hindenburg had a few caveats to it, but as you can see, it only protected people until 1936. Now, how do you determine a Jew? Well, there's the chart on the right. And we're not going to look at it, just defines who's a Jew. And what about on the left? The disabled, those who can contribute nothing to society, but simply are a drain on its resources. Why are we spending thousands of Reichsmarks to take care of someone who can do nothing to help the country? If your ideology is the state is everything, and our ideology of what the state means also allows us to perform euthanasia. And that indeed is something that happened throughout Nazi Germany up until the end of the war. If you're retarded, severely disabled, whatever, we can decide you no longer matter. Now, what's your moral code? Well, you have a practical issue involved. How much money can you afford to spend when you don't have infinite resources? And remember, the Germans already tried printing a lot of money and that didn't work, okay? So you've got those issues in front of you. What's your moral code? Where does it stem? What's its origin? If it's in the ideology, then this is legitimate. And then you legitimize it through your laws. Here's another way in which you can change the matrix. Only people of German or related blood are citizens. Now, once you have decided someone is no longer a citizen of your country, then they become non-persons. Okay? The laws that pertain to citizens are your protection against the excesses of government. But if you're not a citizen, then it is perfectly legitimate to do whatever you wish with those individuals. Now, at this particular time, the Nazis were not interested in killing the Jews. What they were interested in was getting rid of them by having them emigrate. But in their emigration, they didn't want the Jews taking their wealth. So they were severely restricted on what they could take with them as they chose to leave. And it was things like this that caused many of the high German scientists, including Einstein, to leave Germany. But if you had to leave pretty much all your wealth behind, and you are recognized in no other country as a citizen of that country, then how do you land anywhere? You become stateless. And if you're stateless, then any country can do whatever they wish with you, including refusing entry. Why should we take stateless people into our country? This is a generic question, who have no particular right to be here. They've circumvented our laws by being dumped on our property. Let's say that you're France, all right? And you'll see what happens when the Jews try to go to Poland, because that's a perfect example of what they decided in Poland would happen. Okay. In fact, this is it, all right? Poland sees that there are a great many Jews in Germany who have as their ethnic background having come from Poland. Remember that Poland was not a country for a long period of time. It was occupied by Germany and Russia at different times. And in fact, in Russia, they had put a lot of the Jews into one particular area rather than have them spread throughout the empire. But when Poland's constituted as a nation with its border with Germany, the Polish government says, all those Jews who used to be in Polish Germany are now seeing themselves as belonging to us. Now, you're a government. You have to decide what you can do. You're not a very powerful nation. Your finances are limited. And now you've got this influx you're facing of who knows how many thousands. So what does Poland do? It says your passport has to have a control stamp, and we're not giving it to you, which means you can't enter our country. So 70,000 Polish Jews are left in Germany. Where are they going to go? How are they going to get out? And yet the Nazis look at it and say, geez, we're trying to get rid of these people. Where are we going to send them? But if you can't emigrate, what do you do? Well, Germany just says you're non-citizens. We're going to expel you. To where? Yes.
Maybe I missed something in history, but why did they hate the Jewish people?
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. I'll try to make it very brief. Anti-Semitism is something that has been a European construct for centuries. I mean, centuries. And their acceptance or non-acceptance into various countries has tied primarily to a couple of things. One is that as a group, they were often seen as very insulated. That is, they had separate culture, separate language, separate dynamics. They practiced a religion which for centuries was nothing like the religions that were existing in, say, pagan Rome, or even in Christian Rome and Byzantium later on. So there was that separation which made them perceived as other. The other part was that many Jews became successful in the merchant trade and banking. And because of that, there were a number of situations, and this occurred throughout Europe. It occurred through, and when I use the word Europe, I mean territorial Europe, from the Ural Mountains, okay, all the way to the Spanish coast, and to large parts of the Near East, which was taken over by Islam and always identified Jews and Christians as other. And they were given particular restrictions on how they could function within a society. Within that system, though, there was a constant perception passed down through generations that the Jews were other and exploitive. Now, whether that's legitimate or not is out of the question, because once the idea is implanted and then legitimized in a government, and governments throughout history have done this. This isn't unique to Nazi Germany at all. Once you delegitimize a group, then you can do with them as you wish. So for example, under Islam, and I'll use the Armenians as an example, who were Christian at the time when Islam took over their lands, was they were second-class citizens. Within the construct of an Armenian community, as long as the conflict was between two Armenians, it could be adjudicated by the Armenian community, usually the local priest. If it was between an Armenian and a Muslim, it went to the Muslim courts. And as a Jew or a Christian, you paid a special tax called the jizya to the government in order to continue to live within the system. Okay? So the idea of tolerance was always constructed around a different matrix, depending on the government. So when we talk about the tolerance of different religions, say under Islam back in 600 to 800 and up to 1,000, that legitimization always meant you were seen as a second-class citizen. You weren't completely excluded, but there were very severe restrictions in what you could do and what professions you could have. What happened here was that the Jews were kicked out of all of the professions. You couldn't become a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, anything of this sort. So again, the idea was that even your children could not be educated in a state school. How does this translate? By 1938, when a German diplomat is assassinated in Paris by a Jewish teenager, okay, think about what you've heard of Daniel Pearl, the journalist, being executed by, I don't know, it was Al-Qaeda or ISIS, having his head cut off on a video. what that implanted in your mind about that kind of people. And if you're already inclined to see that kind of people as evil, then this kind of situation certainly legitimizes what happens next. And what happens next is this destructiveness on Kristallnacht. Broken crystals, crystal night, translate it as you wish. But notice that the SA and the police did not interfere. Now, if you want an interesting example of this, you can look to American history just recently. In Baltimore, there were a whole series of riots that occurred, and the mayor of Baltimore had the police stand down and said, listen, it's just property, okay? So don't go shooting looters. Let them take the stuff and just don't interfere. It's just property. We don't want people to get hurt. And the same was true in Seattle when they took over a whole section of Seattle, and in Portland, where the police were deliberately told, stand down. You're not to interfere. Okay? So these are examples. In fact, there's a situation that's developed in, I think it's San Francisco, where shoplifting is no longer considered a crime. Now you're going to say, what? No, it's no longer a crime. So the police do not interfere. And there are videos of gangs going into places like, I'll say Walmart or Walgreens or whatever, and taking what they want and just going out the door. So as a result, a number of stores, companies are closing their stores completely. They're just saying, what's the point if we can't stop shoplifting? But that is the policy. And it's legitimate because it's been passed by the government in San Francisco. So you may not like it, but that's the way it operates. Okay? All right. I bring these points out because we're living through a number of these things. And again, you can challenge my ideas. I have no problem with that. But the idea isn't to point to one group or the other, but to use examples. Now, through this period of time, the other thing that is absolutely necessary for Hitler is to unify the German people. And he does it through a whole variety of different elements that we'll see outlined here. Some of these I will not discuss in some length. Some I'll save for another lecture, the last lecture that we have coming up. But I want you to at least see that through the period of the 30s, shortly after Hitler comes to power as Chancellor in 1933, the things that he was able to do to achieve what his ideology indicated, to unify the German people, right? Because if you look at World War I and you look at the Versailles Treaty and you look at how the separation of populations occurred and how this took populations of Germans and placed them in other countries, becomes a real problem. And the second part is that Germany is coming back on the world stage. Germany is an incredibly important, not just geographic, but economic power, even during the Depression. You can't function without acknowledging its existence and giving it room on the world stage. Think of modern day China. Okay. We could ignore China up until about 1973, 74, when Nixon finally said, we got to do something about this. There are just too many people here to ignore. And that has become a formulation of American policy to engage with China and consider China a world power as a result. And China, in its own way, has been working diligently to unify its people to the point, for example, where the Uyghurs, Muslims in the northwest of China, are being indoctrinated or literally put in concentration camps. And again, if you're not aware of this, it's out there on the news. You can find it easily. The idea is we are unifying all the Chinese people. And part of the thrust and issues related to Taiwan, even though the Taiwanese ethnically are different, there are enough native Chinese who left in 49 when the communists took over mainland China, that now Taiwan is legitimately seen by the Chinese government, legitimate in their mind, that this is part of China. And anybody interfering with that, you're interfering with our sovereignty. And the buildup in the South China Sea and the buildup of the Chinese Navy and hypersonic missiles is all related to that. This is no different. And he's able to do it. I show this because the Rhineland was occupied by the winning powers, Britain, France, the United States, at the end of World War I. And it took a great deal of energy on the part of the three countries to keep their forces there. It's, you know, Germany isn't paying for this, all right? So within a relatively short time, the United States pulled out of the Rhineland, left Britain and France there. And in fact, when Germany was defaulting on its reparations, the French advanced over the Rhineland period and occupied the Ruhr, which was the major industrial production area of Germany at the time. And then only later, after a bunch of negotiations and things of that nature, did they withdraw. But the Rhineland was to be demilitarized even when the French and British left. Hitler says, the heck with that. The Rhineland is our country. We define our borders. We defend our borders. So we are going to remilitarize. If that means building fortifications and putting our army there, we're going to do it. And you have no right to stop us. This is our country, not yours. And so the powers have said, well, I guess we have to accept that because the only alternative is to go to war with Germany again. Who wants that? We just got done with the most destructive war in recent memory. And we're going to fight again? Give me a break. So they occupied it without opposition. And the people there were ecstatic because now the foreign occupiers are gone. You see? I can go where I want. I'm a German citizen. I don't have to, when I go from the French section to the British section, to have to show my papers. Okay? You can really begin to understand that. What about the rest of German-speaking peoples? Austria is German-speaking. A little bit different accent. Okay, that's like the South. But the point is that they were German people. And Austria, having been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, dismembered by the Treaty of Versailles and the subsequent Treaty of Saint-Germain and others that broke this empire up. They're saying Austria is basically economically, militarily insignificant. It has no real force within the world powers and construct, and it can hardly defend itself. But they're German people. If we bring them into the nation of Germany, then we will be more powerful. We will have a greater presence on the national stage. We can, international stage, we can defend ourselves, our borders. And we can bring ourselves as unified. Think of Americans living in northern Mexico, or better yet, think back to when Americans were living in Texas when it was part of Mexico. These are Americans. Yes.
I wonder if you can show me what Poland is on the map.
Poland, all right. You see the two pink, see the pink blob in the right corner that's separated from the big pink blob?
On the right side.
On the right side, that's Poland.
Oh,
Yeah, I think, I don't know if this works.
so
There.
they weren't German speaking.
No, no, they speak Polish.
Had a lot of agreements with them.
Yes, but Poland had its own language. And Yiddish, for example, is a mixture of Polish, German, Hebrew, a kind of compendium, because when Jews lived in that area and wanted to maintain their identity, which was a natural concern, but they still incorporated local languages into what was going on. So it became more of a polyglot kind of arrangement. So what did Austria think? They loved it. Now, you can look at The Sound of Music and say, oh, listen, by this time we know Hitler's bad. Well, not really. Okay, he's unifying the German people. And interestingly, if you listen to The Sound of Music or you read that story, the fellow was a captain in the Austrian Navy. He fought in World War I for Austria at the time as part of the empire. But now Austria is down to this little enclave of German-speaking people, and he wants none of it. Okay, lovely story, true story, but keep it in mind. Now, what about Czechoslovakia? This shows you the German-speaking population. Now look at that upper corner, and the very dark brown are predominantly 75% of the population is German. So when you look at this and you realize that the borders of Czechoslovakia were established by the victorious powers in the Treaty of Versailles, and one of the principles that Woodrow Wilson had talked about, which was ethnicity being central to a functioning state. He was looking to unify ethnic groups under the same political construct. But what did they do with Czechoslovakia? Well, they cut out a whole lot of Germans. Now, there was a reason for this that goes beyond just the ethnicity issue, and that is that if you want to defend Czechoslovakia, you need the right terrain to do it. And so the Sudetenland had the kind of terrain where fortifications could be built, force channeling of armies that might invade Czechoslovakia, particularly from the north and the west. But they also were worried about Hungary, which is off to the upper right. So you give this territory to Czechoslovakia so that it's not only primarily an ethnic unity, but because they have to have defensible terrain. Well, Hitler looks at this and says, these are German people. They belong and were part of Germany before the end of World War I, and you've just cut them off. You've made them second-class citizens. They're delegitimized through the way government works and functions and who can progress and who can't. It's not as though Czechoslovakia was an open democracy. All of these nations had to work diligently to try to save themselves from internal collapse. And they had to worry about external collapse because they could see the risks on the horizon for themselves. So in this particular kind of situation, think of the Crimea in eastern Ukraine, and think of parts of Estonia and Latvia that are occupied by a large number of Russians, ethnically and linguistically. And what has legitimized Putin's maneuvers in those areas? These are Russian people. So the political boundaries don't matter. Edwards Benet, all right. By 38, he realizes Czechoslovakia is doomed. Okay. They tried to see if they can finesse this out, but you'll see that in December of 38, there's a French-German non-aggression pact. From Benet's position, this means France won't help us if Germany presses hard. So when all this happens, he ends up being the signatory of what's going on. Now, how did, yes?
Benet, was he Slovak or Czech?
Czech. Heinlein, not the author, had developed the Nazi Party influence in Czechoslovakia as the Nazi parties were established in England, in the United States, France, and other places where they had very little ultimate influence, but they were particularly influential in the Sudetenland because of the high proportion of German-speaking people. So it made it a natural that someone like this would be dominant in working with the central German government and working against the Beneš government in order to create a unified Germany. Okay. So what happens? Without going too much into detail here, what I do want to point out is that Hitler basically has told the rest of the world, I'm going to unify German people under German central authority. Come hell or high water. Now you can try to determine what you think you're going to do about it. But I will tell you that because I have been rebuilding the German military, and there were some, I'll call them propaganda issues that helped make other countries believe that Germany was much more powerful than it actually was. That basically Hitler could go to the foreign powers, particularly England, and say to them, I'm taking the Sudetenland. I'm going to take it by force if you disagree, but you're hardly in a position where you're going to want to invade my country and get into another war this soon after World War I. And after all the troubles and tribulations and depression and everything else going on, that's the last thing you guys are going to want. And this area represents my people that you carved away. This is your fault, not mine. I'm simply bringing the German people back under a single authority. So what happens? Chamberlain says, okay, makes sense. I think you have a good argument. And so what does Chamberlain do? He agrees, and he returns to England waving a piece of paper. Says, peace in our time. I have met with Herr Hitler. We've come to this agreement. Now, what about Beneš? They basically went to Beneš and said, sign the paper. Right? We're not coming to your aid. And if Germany invades you, you're on your own. Well, Czechoslovakia is landlocked. What do they got? Nothing, right? They might defend for a while, but it ain't going to last. So they give in. And then what happens? Well, then Hitler decides he'll take all of Czechoslovakia, because if you look at the structure, the geography, you'll realize that even the remnant of Czechoslovakia is like a spear in the side of Germany. But if Germany occupies all of Czechoslovakia, not only does it gain access to materials and production, particularly the Skoda arms work, which was manufacturing some very relatively advanced weaponry, but you have now removed a particular threat to your flanks if things are going to get hairy down the road. Now, nothing happens significantly internationally, but more happens around the periphery of Czechoslovakia, in particular, again, which we're not told about or learn about in most histories. Poland takes over a section. Oh my goodness. Hungarian authorities, hey, we want to be part of Hungary. I mean, after all, that's our ethnic group. Okay. So you have these different countries around Czechoslovakia that see its weakness. It sees its lack of international support as an entity. And it makes it easy with pseudo-legitimacy to take it over, to chop away portions. It makes it legal. Okay? So keep this in mind, because from Hitler's standpoint, his dynamic up to this particular stage is that he is technically willing to risk war, but he realizes the risks are very small. But the potential gains to Germany are enormous because he has a reasonable argument. Now, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, when he takes over the rest of the country, that stirs up a little bit of anger and frustration. And there's an interesting speech that Hitler gives in response to a letter from FDR, that he reads to the Reichstag, mocking FDR's letter, because FDR is basically saying, we want you to agree not to take the following countries. and FDR lists a whole bunch of the countries around Germany. And I mean, frankly, you get a letter like that, and you're thinking to yourself, this guy's a joke. Are you kidding me? Where's the force behind this that would make me pay attention to it? It becomes a joke. Okay, so I keep that in mind as some of these little interesting things. So this shows what happens as the rest of Czechoslovakia is taken over, but sections that are taken by other countries, Poland, Hungary, all right, the area is collapsing into nothingness. Now, you folks have been very patient to listen to almost over an hour of uninterrupted lecturing on my part. There's approximately 25 minutes remaining to the 2-hour session at 3 o'clock. Do you want me to just continue and sort of finish up so we're not too terribly far behind? So when I come to the last lecture next week, I can try to reach most of the end of what's going on. I tend, as you already are aware, to sort of wander off a little bit. But I think one of the things that I hope comes out of this set of lectures is that what was happening in the 20s and 30s doesn't remain in the 20s and 30s as the way we think about things. And I just hope in terms of all of us, we can appreciate this at the end. All right, so I'll go ahead. World War I, enormously destructive, right? It was not the most destructive war in history, right? Depending on the percentage of populations involved, it doesn't fall into the top 2 or 3. If you talk about it in terms of just sheer numbers, yes, there is a huge impact. But as I showed in one of the very early slides of how the world changes, from 1900 to 2000, the world population goes up by almost 5 billion people. Almost, that's frankly unheard of in the history of Homo sapiens. Right? That kind of change in 100 years is just inconceivable. But nations didn't want to get into war again. They'd been through this. This was something horribly destructive, and we got to fix it. Okay? Now, how do we fix it? Well, let's all get together and talk about our problems and see if we can't come to a diplomatic solution for most of our issues. Ergo, the League of Nations, ergo, the United Nations. But within the context of that, what you have to remember is that the League serves as a platform for the most insignificant but politically acceptable nation who's joined to have a platform in front of the rest of the nations of the world and discuss its problems and its issues related to neighbors or international trade or any of a host of other problems. So that forum becomes an important place for that word to get out. It was particularly important when I talked about Ethiopia and the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, that Haile Selassie could go to the League of Nations and talk to the world at large. But the fundamental flaw in the League of Nations, no authority, no power. And that is actually largely true of the United Nations. If you put aside the Korean conflict, okay, which occurred as a United Nations action, primarily because Russia absented itself from the vote. That was practically the only time that the United Nations as such, as an organization, stood up to military aggression. So in this regard, it was a great forum. They could talk about all manner of difficulties. And look at this, human and drug trafficking. This is in 1920. But if you remember the Opium Wars that occurred when Britain was forcing opium into China and narcotizing much of its population, Think about fentanyl in our country with, I think last year, 100,000 deaths, overdoses, something, some mix of that, all right? And those are mostly young folk who are dying. Global health, prisoners of war, protection of minorities. What could be better? Except you have no way to enforce it. It's often been laid at the feet of the United States that the reason the League failed is because we were not there. I disagree with that interpretation. This is my own personal judgment on the matter. And it's based on the following issues. One, we were becoming more isolationist. We saw what happened in Europe. If you look again at Wilson's 14 points, he didn't want these secret treaties secretly arrived at with secret conventions. He wanted things open. He did not see that the forum was necessarily going to work, but he promoted it. But the American people were saying, we're not yielding our sovereignty to the League of Nations. We're not going to let them tell us what to do. And we don't want to get embroiled in more of this global nonsense where countries are fighting other countries. If we're going to get involved, it's going to be on our own decision process. Nobody's going to tell us we have to get involved. Now, if you think about the United Nations, that's still true. What is different? NATO. Under Article 5 in NATO, if one of the NATO countries is attacked, all of the NATO countries are obligated to come to its defense. You see, there's a different emphasis that occurs as a result of that construct. In addition, as we moved into the 20s, and we're doing very well economically until the crash, we're saying, what do we need the rest of Europe for anyway? We're doing pretty darn well on our own wick. Why should we get drawn into all of these disputes? We're better off just sort of shipping our goods all over. Now, when the crash hits, it's a whole different ballgame, but then you're looking at it and saying, we don't want those people coming and telling us what to do when our economy's in the toilet. So again, you have that particular construct. A few triumphs, there were some arguments where diplomacy, negotiation, no use of force, no threat of force, allowed certain decisions to come to a diplomatic end. Fine, great. But look at the failures. And if you look at the destructiveness of these failures, if you were to add up all the casualties related to those things, then I think the defeats outweigh the triumphs by a huge amount. But that's not to say that the League of Nations was the only source of diplomacy to try to lessen the possibilities of war and disarmament. There were very powerful forces throughout the world that sought an end to these kinds of conflicts. And as a result, what I've outlined here is a whole series of different diplomatic initiatives that were designed specifically to lower the threat of international armed conflict. One centerpiece to much of this was the insecurity France felt having been invaded in 1914. And while it saw itself as still the dominant power on the continent, Germany rapidly was recovering economically. And France, on the other hand, for reasons which are not entirely clear, did not have the growth of population or the growth of its economy that existed within Germany. So even though the Germans were fighting on two fronts and lost several millions killed, wounded, missing, and so on, yet France, even with British support, was unable to resurrect its population. And they saw this as a very distinct threat. So they needed assurance that somehow their security could be established through some of these different agreements. And as we'll see, or as you already know, that didn't work. These are different naval conferences. And here, interestingly, is another piece that begins to fit our puzzle when we look at the outbreak of World War II. And that is the United States is beginning to see Japan as a particular threat in the Far East. Now, why does this happen? Japan was an ally of the Entente powers in World War I. It was on the side of France and Germany. The United States, remember, didn't get in until 1917. What did Japan win as a result of being in the war? They took over the German colonies, including the islands that were in the Pacific that were controlled by Germany. And they took over a couple of enclaves on the Chinese coast, mainland China. Shandong is one of the provinces that they had and controlled, and we'll see how that plays out at another time. So the point was that Japan saw itself in a particular position where it is now a very important player, particularly in the Asian sphere and the Western Pacific, but is recognized increasingly by being part of these negotiations as a world power. And their particular negotiations, particularly in the Locarno Pact, which was on the preceding slide, where the tonnage of the critical capital ships is established, Britain with 5, United States 5, Japan with 3. Because Japan's only going to be in the Pacific, but the United States has a 2-ocean commitment and Britain has a global commitment, that means that you are dominant in that area. And subsequent agreements followed the same pattern. Now, when Japan finally gets enough of a hold in China, Manchuria, and so on and so on, we'll talk about that in the next lecture. The opposition to their actions is such that Japan walks out of the League of Nations and just says, the hell with you. We're going to do what we want to do. We are now a dominant power and you have no way to stop us from doing what we're doing. And we're going to do it until you make us not do it. And you're not inclined to do that. So I mention these particular things as a way of establishing it. Now, this is one of the things that people have pointed to and said, oh, the key to the League of Nations was to put the United States in as a capstone. And we weren't about to do it. Now, this is seen as a deficiency. But at that particular time in American history, you'd look at it and say, do I want to go back to Iraq and Afghanistan? Is that something you feel would be important? Yeah, I think most of us would say, you got to be kidding me. We spent trillions of dollars and lost thousands of people killed and wounded, and who knows what else with PTSD. Screw it, let them fight their own battles, right? They don't matter to us. They're not that important. Okay, in spite of however else it's presented. So as they go through this is another beautiful idea. You'll notice the tigers and the crocodile and a bunch of sheep. Okay. What's good for thee is not necessarily good for me. So we're going to tell you what you can get, and we're going to do what we want to do. Okay. Again, part of the perversion of how governments can function according to their ideology, their belief systems, what fundamentally underpins their organization and construct of their government and the government policies, both domestic and international. Now, I'll do the quick introduction here because another piece of history that most of us are just not familiar with it. We kind of have it in the back of our minds. We know it went on, but we don't understand much of what happened or the destructiveness of what happened. But the Sino-Japanese War lasted for 14 years under different constructs and without the formal declaration of war until somewhat later, where Japan formally declared war on China. Up until that particular time, it had been warring with China and it had been taking territory after territory after territory. How did this all start? Without trying to beat this up too much, the Kuomintang, which is a term you might have heard, the nationalist government of China had been established after a revolution occurred, which got rid of the Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for centuries. And the emperor at the time, Puyi, was basically tossed out, abdicated, and became, in a way, a non-entity until the Japanese established Manchuria and put Puyi back in as a puppet. When Puyi and the Qing dynasty were eliminated, there was an attempt to form a republic. You may have heard of Sun Yat-sen. We'll talk a little bit about him. I'll show you a picture of him in a little bit. And Sun Yat-sen tried among various groups and organizations to coalesce so he could form a functional government. And the functional government, the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, became that formulation, later taken over by Chiang Kai-shek, right? At the time that this was happening, however, there were strong communist influences and cells developing, not necessarily at the behest of Moscow, but Moscow was certainly encouraging it, and in many places and times funding it in order to establish their ideological goal, which was world revolution and the rise of the proletariat. Only Mao, instead of looking at the cities, the proletariat as defined by the Russians, looked at the peasantry, the rural peasants, for his support. Now, there was an incident that took place because Japan controlled Korea at this point and had a strong border with the Soviet Union, Russia, to the north, and mainland China and Manchuria to the west. And at some of the crossing points there were important railroad systems. As a result, the Japanese had a relatively strong military presence, not overwhelming, but relatively strong in that location. And it is very clear from historical investigation that what happened that precipitated this Mukden incident was initiated by the Japanese to make the Chinese look guilty and allow the Japanese military to invade. Now, how did this happen without the authority of the central Japanese government? Because again, without trying to go through a complicated history, the rise of the military in Japan, especially after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, had become ascendant in the political system within Japan. Now, the emperor still had the final say. So the idea that Hirohito didn't know what was going on is wrong. He knew. He may not have had much opportunity to change it, but if he had said no, it wouldn't have happened. So in a sense, he was complicit in all the things that were going on. The other unfortunate aspect is that permeating the Japanese military at this time was a philosophy which said junior officers could take initiative even if it wasn't agreed upon by their superiors. And as we'll see in the next, I think it's the next slide or two, that's exactly what happens. So in a sense, as has happened in historical events in the past going way back, sometimes a junior officer will instigate an action which commits the country to a particular course of action. And I'll give you one specific example from United States history, right? Actually, not the United States. Colonial America. George Washington takes a small group to go towards a French fort, which is in Pennsylvania, which he's been told he's to go there and tell the French to get out. En route, his group comes across a group of Frenchmen and some Native Americans, and they get into a fight where the Frenchmen are killed. Washington goes back home and says, I think we may have made a mistake. And the French on their part say, oh, you want to fight? In many ways, that became part of the instigation of what we call the French and Indian Wars. And in Europe, because of the way it spread, was the 7 Years' War. Some people even call that the First World War. I think that's pushing the topic a bit. But it gives you an example of how you can commit a nation to a course of action based on something that you look at and say, well, it's just pretty trivial. Okay, that's what happened. So war breaks out. And I just mentioned here, you'll notice Japan doesn't declare war until June of 1938. One of the things the Japanese did fairly frequently in their period of modernization was they would get into fights without declaring war. And indeed, it was that disconnect between fighting and declaring war that often made them look like the bad guy. And you may remember when we come to December 7, that Nomura, who was the diplomat in Washington at the time for the Japanese government, was trying to translate the final response of the Japanese government, which was to be passed on to Cordell Hull. And they were to have it in his hands by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which was coordinated with when the attack on Pearl Harbor was supposed to occur a short time later. So we have the declaration of war in front of you, and now we're fighting. Oops, didn't happen because they were delayed in the translation. So they didn't show up at Hull's office until after Hull already knew Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And they said, oh, sneak attack. You attacked us before war was declared. So we couldn't be ready for you. You just snuck up, and you see it on the street sometimes with a video where somebody walks up behind a guy who's walking down the street, slugs him in the back of the head. If you haven't seen those videos, they're very interesting. But that's what happens. It's a sneak attack. Sun Yat-sen, talk about this. He had a very interesting kind of life. He was a very well-educated man. He had worked diligently for years to get rid of the Qing dynasty. He had different organizations with which he cooperated and actually ran, and then he'd get kicked out and he'd go into exile, and then he would come back. And as you'll notice down at the bottom, accepted aid from Russia. And the Communist Party in China at the time was told by the Kremlin, you're to work with him. Indeed, the Russians supported Chiang Kai-shek for a good period of time. And later, so did the Germans. So an interesting element. Chiang Kai-shek. Again, I have a book that's titled The Man Who Lost China. Think about what that title means. The guy was incompetent. He could have won. He didn't. Something was wrong with him. Okay. If only he'd won. Well, it's obviously much more complex than that. But his own particular authority is established because he was a protege of Sun Yat-sen. And notice that he went to Russia for military and political training. Okay. Think about Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh went to Russia for training in communist ideology and so on. We didn't label Chiang a communist. Why? Because later on, he ends up saying, screw this. I want no part of those people. And the Communist Party in China is working on an ideology which is not consistent with the history and traditions of the Chinese people. And when you look at what the communists did after they had control in 1949, you'll begin to realize that basically they were going to eliminate the history of China as a culture. And they were going to establish a new culture as though the past needed to be gotten rid of. And that has a huge impact on your own psychology, as well as on what you are permitted and not permitted to do legally. Again, we come back to that dynamic. Okay. All right. So what happens in 1927, he finally says, this is the end of it. I'm going to crush internal opposition, and I'm going to go about this in a way that's going to be brutal. He also had to unify the country, which was fragmenting after the Qing dynasty was gone, under a lot of warlords who could simply say, listen, this is my province. I'll run it the way I want. So Chiang had to arrange coalitions. He had to build a strong infrastructure. He had to build an army. He had to get it trained. And then he had to fight over great distances. If you remember how big China is, it's a huge country. And some of its terrain is literally awful. Okay. So what happens? A communist coup is attempted at Changsha in 1930. Now, just as an aside, I'll say my sister-in-law was grew up in Changsha. And in talking with her at different times, her family lived through the period when the Chinese communists eventually took over, and even in their history when the Japanese ended up taking Changsha and what they did. Now, she's not that old, but she grew up as a child during the period of the communist domination. Mao, again, a surprisingly well-educated person. Jean and I have actually visited his birthplace in China and seen where he grew up and the kind of environment he grew up. He grew up in a very nice environment. I mean, it's made more pleasant now, but it's really a pretty area. Kind of a good start. But ideologically, he could reject all that. And what became dominant was as he looked at China, looked at the corruption and destruction and the oppression, and he said, this cannot persist. We have to change this. There has to be a better dynamic. So ideologically, he says, in order for us to do that, we have to eliminate opposition. So in 1930, he makes his first attempt at a coup. And it's defeated. But during the period of time, now Chiang Kai-shek, who's identified the communists as an enormous threat to historical China, ends up chasing the communists into what's called the Long March. It looks as though the communists have been destroyed. And Chiang gets diverted in part because of what's happening in Manchuria. So he can't give the coup de grace, if you will. And Mao, to give him enormous credit, takes the survivors on a huge, called the Long March, into the mountainous region of China in order to get away from Chiang and rebuild the Communist Party and its authority. This is an extraordinary accomplishment. And a few of the people who survived with him, like Deng Xiaoping, who became premier of China, and Chu Enlai, whose name you may have heard. These people worked with him, lived with him, suffered with him in order to create the communist revolt or revolution that was eventually successful. I mention this because it's an interesting element, and I keep showing you different principles and things. This is primarily military principles, but this is something that Mao used throughout his career in all of the issues that involved not just fighting within China itself, but used this even in Korea when the Chinese came in to help the North Koreans. Didn't work very well in northern Vietnam when they invaded after the Americans had left. I don't know if you're aware that the Chinese actually had a real border fight with Vietnam after they had unified the country and so on. But the issues that you're looking at here have to do with there's nothing that's identified that says we are going to become wealthy. These people are sacrificing everything. They're putting their lives on the line, literally, because if you were caught by Chiang Kai-shek soldiers, you were likely to just be taken out and shot. Now, this isn't a matter of just imprisonment or you get a trial. I mean, it's brutal. It's brutal. I mentioned about Hirohito. You'll see that he was in reign. It was from 1926. This guy knew what was going on because the first major incident in China is 1931. This fellow is prime minister. Now, his dates don't correlate with what's going on, but the reason I show him is that first, we're not familiar with many of the Japanese leaders, their names. but they also have an enormous influence. You notice the military outfits. This is true for whoever preceded him and who followed him. The military was the government. I put these two up because these are the two guys in Manchuria that are responsible for the Mukden incident and the initiation of the invasion of Manchuria. They're junior officers. Ishiwara is a lieutenant colonel. If you're interested, I think either on Amazon Prime or Netflix, you can actually find a documentary about him. Now, Itagaki, you don't find, even though he was senior to Ishiwara. But they initiated this event on their own. They didn't have the approval of the central government to do it. This guy you've all heard about, Hideki Tojo, he actually has nothing to do with this at this particular time, even though he was commander of the Kwantung Army subsequently. But he becomes the prime minister later on. And of course, most of us have heard his name. I mention this because the Northern Expedition takes place around the time that Chiang had tried to crush the Chinese communists. And while he was also consolidating his hold over the various warlords so he could have a unified China. But he has to go north in part to finish off the opposition that's going on, but also to be present in some of the major areas where there's considerable agitation by the Japanese. The Japanese, remember, had been in this region since the early 1900s. So it wasn't as though the Chinese and the Japanese suddenly confronted each other, you know, somehow had never been there. They'd been there and they'd had their troubles back and forth. But he begins to see that this is going to be a danger spot. And in 1931, it breaks out much more openly. Oh, sorry, wrong direction. And part of what Itagaki and Ishiwara talked about among themselves and in plotting this was that we got to put an end to this kind of confrontation. We've got to settle it. There's another incident that takes place. Again, we don't hear about this very much, but the idea here is that they're suddenly in this province. And if you look carefully at this map, you'll see a little spot over here. That's a province that used to be under German control. It's now taken over by the Japanese at the end of World War I. They consider this theirs. Okay. So when they're there, again, what happens? It ends up that some fighting breaks out. And when the fighting breaks out, the Japanese use artillery to bombard the Chinese side, if you will, and you lose 2,000 to 11,000. You know, the numbers are always so sketchy. But the point is that, think about it. If Canada decided to fire artillery across the St. Lawrence River and killed 1,000 or 2,000 Americans, what would your reaction be? Saying, these are not friendly people, okay? And we've got to do something about this. But unfortunately for the Chinese, they're not powerful enough. The Chinese invade Manchuria, they take it over, they control it. And one of the reasons for showing this slide, and I will finish up fairly soon, because you're all being very patient, unless you've already left at home. I mean, but my audience here is stuck. So I don't know what the rest of you are doing. Notice that you don't see any mechanization. This is 1939. We have this concept somehow that World War II was mechanized. We talk about Panzer divisions in Germany, and we talk about motorized divisions and armored brigades and armored divisions. What we forget is that, except for the United States and to some extent Britain and France, motorization was actually not dominant. Much of what happens is based on people with horses and wagons pulling artillery and supplies. That's true of Germany, Russia, China, Japan, and Italy. We forget that. So I think this is a powerful image. This just shows again what happened and where the United States finally says, you know, something's going on over there in China, which we don't like. And it's not just a matter of the Chinese people. It's a matter of what the Japanese are intending long-term. And how is this going to alter the balance of trade and military power and access to resources and to markets and things of this nature. So what happens is a note, Herbert Hoover's the president, not FDR, with his Secretary of State Stimson. They send this to Japan and say, listen, if you take territory by force, we will not recognize it. Now for Japan, that's a real insult and a challenge. We occupy this territory. This is our territory. You don't get to tell us it doesn't belong to us. We don't care, frankly, whether you recognize it or not. What are you going to do about it? And the United States at this point doesn't have a whole lot it can do. Okay. The puppet state is established, as I mentioned. Puyi is put in there to be the puppet. I showed this, and we'll be finishing up shortly, because you look at this and you say, are those German soldiers? No, they're Chinese. Back in the last lecture, I talked about Van Sicht, who was a German general responsible for the cooperation between Germany and Russia to rebuild the German military, primarily in Russia, because of the restrictions placed by the Versailles Treaty. He created a sub-organization which, once it could be incorporated into Germany proper, once Hitler became Chancellor, and he rejected the Versailles Treaty and said, screw it, we're going to rebuild our national army. They'd already begun the process through the 20s. Von Sicht gets sent to China. And there he helps Chiang Kai-shek train and organize his forces. And he's able to bring resources from Germany. Remember, if you can sell this stuff, right, that's a market for you. So they sell a lot of equipment to China. And therefore, you'll see what looks like German soldiers, but actually these are Chinese soldiers. Now, they didn't have enough to make it work. That's a different story. What this shows you is that in a time, not a timeline, because it's not set up that way, but with different dates, that different events took place, which gradually ended up chopping away at China. And you'll see along the coastline in that lower section here, that once war formally breaks out, that many enclaves are taken over by the Japanese. And subsequently, of course, with the outbreak of World War II, things change even further. This just shows, again, some of the escalations that occur into China as a result of the conflict. Beginning in 1931, Manchukuo becomes a Japanese enclave. Puyi is put there, Manchuria is its other name. But then there are extensions that occur. And down here is part of Shandong province, taken from the Germans at the end of World War I. Now, I'm going to stop there because you've all been very patient. I just want to add one other particular thing.
Hello.
No?
Hi.
You don't want to hear this? We talk about World War II, and historians point.
Marion, mute yourself.
Hello.
Marion,
There you
mute
are. Welcome
yourself.
home.
Hello, you're on the phone, Marion.
Good, because we had a major
Marion,
storm.
you have to mute yourself.
Well,
There
but
you
it was
go.
a good week.
No, I can still hear you. Okay, sorry, let me just throw this out.
Yes, and
The
oh, okay.
beginning of World War I,
Uh-huh.
or sorry, World War II, by most historians, is designated as September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland, and then France and Britain declare war against Germany. I argue that that is not the case. That was still a European war. That was not a world war. So when did World War break out? It broke out on December 12th, 1941, when Germany declared war on the United States because they were allies of Japan. If Germany had not declared war on the United States in December of 41, we would have been at war with Japan, but we would not have been at war with Germany. We would not have been fighting a global war. There would have been global conflicts, but it was not a single world war. But once Germany declared war on the United States on December 12th, that made it a world war. And it drew in all of the resources around the world and numerous other countries, not to fight in Europe, but to fight globally. Africa, Asia, you name it. The only place we didn't fight was Antarctica. But even Australia got bombed by the Japanese at Darwin. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention. There's an enormous amount still to cover. And so be prepared to be here for 4 hours next time. Questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And if I don't have answers, I'll make one up.
Nice you quoted the Kingston Trio. This goes back to my youth. Your definition of the discussion about anti-Semitism. That's as good an explanation as I've ever heard.
Oh, well, thank you.
Really, they said, oh, that was I've been asked that, and it's like, well, it's